in the back and can't hear me, just kind of give a thumbs up and I'll talk a little louder.
On the recorder?
I did, thank you. Yeah, good reminder. Well, hey, you guys, we've been, for a while now, looking in the Bible at what I really think is like just a tremendous thing. And that is, we've been looking at specifically the Old Testament and seeing how Jesus shows up in the Old Testament in various ways. Basically, we've been looking at how God has woven this, like, what I would call a scarlet thread throughout history, leading up to this moment that we see Jesus come onto the scene. And I mean, it really blows my mind because, especially when I think of people that aren't followers of Jesus and that question whether Jesus, really did the things he did, whether God really had a plan for our lives. And yet I see so many of the fingerprints of God throughout this history that just to me are just like solidify my belief in him and following him. And so we've been going basically book by book. And today we're going to look at another book. You know, when I remember when I was in college, I was in a literature class, English literature, and the very first book that we talked about, guess what it was?
The Bible.
It was the Bible. Yeah, because even in English literature class, right? The Bible is considered one of, if not the best and most important piece of literature in the world, right?
History.
In history. And it's amazing to me when we read different books, Shakespeare and, all these guys throughout history. You'll come across this phrase, I'll read something that one of them wrote and I'll be like, wait a minute, I've heard that before. And then I realized oh, hey, they got that from Scripture, right? That's a scripture verse that they used in their literature. And the more I think about it, the more that I'm amazed not only that God would choose to speak through all these different people over time, all these people from all these different backgrounds, David was a king, and we've got Moses, who was this, grew up in Egypt as this unique leader, kind of a unique position. But also, I'm amazed at the different literary styles that God would use to communicate his message to us, right? And so sometimes it's in stories. A lot of the Old Testament is all these stories, right? And that's why we can do Sunday school, because then you can do the flannel graphs and all that kind of thing. Or Veggie Tales, you can create these Veggie Tale stories out of it. Poems, Jesus taught with parables. We've got Paul with his letters that he's written to different groups of people. And then we've got visions like Revelations and Daniel with his visions. There's all these different styles that God has used to communicate with us his message, right? And one of the most incredible sets of books, I think, in the Bible is right in the middle. And that's what we call the wisdom books. And so those books are Job and Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Those are all called the wisdom books, okay? And what makes these books so incredible is that they deal with kind of the big questions of life. What is the meaning of life? That's a pretty big question. Has anybody asked that one before? What is the meaning of life? And how do I fit within this whole big world, right? And David Limbaugh, he says this. I like how he puts it. He says, the wisdom books examine how the world works, humanity's role in it, and how it all fits together under God's superintending sovereignty. Amen. So, what's the meaning of life? Where do I fit into it? how does God view all of this stuff, right? That's basically what we're talking about here. And Job, in particular, delves into kind of a really tricky topic. Again, one that all of us have asked, and that's this, we call it the problem of evil, right? Basically, like, the question is, why does God let bad things happen to good people? Or to personalize it, why do I deal with suffering sometimes? Why do bad things happen to me? That's kind of our ultimate question, isn't it? And so the story is of Job. And Job is this, it says he's a very righteous man. He's upright. Now, we've read stories in the Bible of people who, they made some pretty big mistakes. But this guy, Job, it indicates right from the beginning that he's not really one of those guys. Like, it actually says, like, this guy is a follower of God. He loves God. And so what we see is this righteous man, and he's successful as a man in the world's terms. Okay, so how do we think of success? Well, we think of someone, they've got their wife, they've got a big family, they've got property and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's Job. Job is a...
Hello?
Oh, hey, let's shut down number one. Who said hello?
Amy.
Church.
We gotta turn the power on.
The power helps, doesn't it? Thank you guys for fixing that. Okay, so you know what I thought was happening? Because I didn't recognize your voice, Amy. So there was this one time, because this is obviously a wireless mic, there was one time they were having a wedding upstairs, and somehow rather than connecting to their system, they connected to our system. So we had an event down here, and all of a sudden we're hearing someone else's voice come through the speakers, and we're all like, where is that coming from? And of course they're like testing their mic. They're like, why are we not getting any sound up here? It's because, so my big fear this morning is that as I was talking to the microphone and no sound was coming out here, that my voice was coming somewhere else. Anyway, okay, sorry about that. Glad we're back on track here. This should help. Can you guys turn it down just a tad? You got a little feedback. All right. Technical stuff. Gotta love it. So I was talking about Job. So Job's a good guy, and he's a successful guy. He has a wife. He has a big family. He's got lots of property. He's very wealthy. And he's a man of influence. Everybody in his town, they know him. Okay? And what happens is in an instant, basically, Job loses everything that is important to him. He loses his kids. He loses his flocks. All of it is gone in an instant. And what follows this story of Job's loss is this long, poetic discussion, basically this conversation between Job and some of his friends who have come to comfort him. All right? Now, there's a period of time, I guess, in their culture where you could come and sit with people, but you had to be quiet for a while, right? And finally, Job breaks the silence and starts a conversation, and now all of his friends have to weigh in on the conversation, okay? Does anybody else have people in your family that just love to weigh in on things, love to give their opinions and tell you how life really works? Am I the only one in that? No? Okay. All right, so you know what I'm talking about, right? So here's all of these friends of his, and they make several suggestions about why Job is dealing with this suffering, why all these bad things have happened to him. And they're often framed around the idea that Job must have done something wrong in God's eyes. And sometimes probably some of us have felt that before. Maybe we've had something that just wiped out our finances. I know I feel like I've had that many times in my life. I'm doing good. I've got a little money saved up maybe. And then all of a sudden, the car goes And I'm just like, God, like, I've been trying to save money, like, and now I have to spend all my money on this stupid car to get it fixed. My brother-in-law, he just paid off his car a couple months ago, and his engine just stopped. And it's going to be $7,000 to get a new engine. I was like, oh, why do things like that happen to us? They're so frustrating. But I can imagine being in Job's shoes. I can't imagine one day waking up and I've lost my house and I've lost my job and I've lost my kids. Like, I can't really go there in my mind. And this is where Job is at. Now, I imagine that during this conversation between Job and his friends, God is kind of doing, the face palm, right? He's like, oh, they just don't get it. Like, they've got all these different perspectives, but it's not my perspective. They don't see things the way that I see things. And so Job's friends are making all these guesses, but you know what? They're all wrong. And I'm thankful that in the book of Job, we kind of get God's perspective on the matter. We see how things really played out. Now, what we don't get is a lot of really clear answers. Like, sometimes I read Job and I'm like, God, you didn't really answer the question. Like, why? Why did these things happen? But we see that it's not that our human understanding and our human wisdom is limited when it comes to truly understanding God's ways. That's the big message I believe that we have here. And God, in his wisdom, whatever that might be, he allowed these bad things to happen to Job. And the amazing thing to me about Job is that even in his limited understanding, Job does not charge God with wrongdoing, and he doesn't immediately assume, like many of us probably would do, or many people in our culture, he doesn't just assume that, well, God doesn't exist, right? He keeps pursuing, he keeps looking for God, even in the midst of this terrible, terrible suffering and pain that he's going through. And instead, after a while of asking his own questions, Job ends up encountering God. And God begins questioning Job. It's really pretty interesting. He asks all these rhetorical questions, taking Job on this journey through creation. Kind of like, hey, were you there when I set the gazelles in motion? And I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but like, were you there when I did this at the beginning of creation? And when I did this in Africa? And when I did this in, all these things. And so he takes Job on this journey. And of course the answer is no. Job wasn't there. Only the Lord was involved in creating those things, right? And only he is the source of true wisdom and true understanding. And in this encounter, here's the beautiful thing, is that Job truly begins to understand who God is. He truly begins to understand. And here's a key verse to me. These are the words of Job after he's encountered God. It's Job 42. I believe it's verse 5. I don't have it in my notes, but I think Amy has it up there. It says this. Job says, of God, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. My ears had heard of you. He was an upright man. He was following what he believed were God's ways. But he says, now something has shifted. After all of this that I've been through, there's something that's different. And that is that now I have encountered God himself. I think that's beautiful. There's this shift. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about church, and especially really established churches. The kind of churches where people have grown up in that church and they've been there for a long time, and But we were just talking about even the church